Welcome to another episode of the Third Eye Podcast, the podcast that is dedicated to open dialogue regarding the difficult topics that we all face in life. I am your host, Marcus Callahan, and thank you very much for joining me this evening. Good evening, and welcome back to another episode of the Third Eye Podcast. I hope you all have had a wonderful week and weekend. And speaking of weekend, the Super Bowl was this past Sunday, and I would like to give a shout out and special congratulations to Coach Andy Reid and the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, my wife is most likely going to kill me when she hears this because she is a diehard Broncos fan, but sometimes you just have to give respect where respect is due, and it has been a long time coming for Coach Reid, and he absolutely deserved to be able to hoist that Lombardi trophy, so shout out to them, and I already cannot wait for the next season. Go Pack, go. You already know. All right, so last episode, we talked about the divide that partisan politics is creating in America, and a little bit about the upcoming primary election and the Democrats who are running. And this past Monday was the Iowa caucus, and let me just start by saying this. It was nothing short of a debacle. The DNC failed to get the results on time, which caused mayhem. And by the time they released the results, I was able to witness not only Republican voters tear down Democratic voters for something they had no control over, but Democratic voters tore each other down as well. And as I watched this all unfold, I couldn't help but think about the nasty behavior and whether it was learned from home during younger years, or was it simply just human nature to lash out and be nasty toward those who think differently than we do. Which brings me to today's topic, which is nature versus nurture, and whether or not we as a society are defined by our circumstances or are our choices that we make what truly define us. The nature versus nurture debate involves the extent to which particular aspects of behavior are a product of either inherited or acquired influences. Nature is what we think of as pre-wiring and is influenced by genetic inheritance and other biological factors. Nurture is generally taken as the influence of external factors after conception, for example, the product of exposure, life experiences, and the learning of an individual. The nature-nurture debate is concerned with the relative contribution that both influences make up the human behavior, such as personality, cognitive traits, temperament, and psychopathology. But when it comes to society, nature is represented by the circumstances in which a person is born, versus nurture being the life experiences that shape us and help turn us into who we think we're supposed to be. So the reason I chose to speak about this topic tonight is because oftentimes the phrase, "this is just how I am," is thrown around when it comes to a person's behavioral traits. So it begs the question, is a person's circumstances responsible for the way they behave, or can they unlearn what they have been associated with throughout life to inform their own opinions and choices? One argument often used in this debate is that of behaviorism. Behaviorism refers to a psychological approach which emphasizes scientific and objective methods of investigation. The approach is only concerned with observable stimulus-response behaviors and states all behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment. From the moment we are born, we are a product of our environment. The things that shape us as a human being, like our parents' morals and values, to our heritage and culture, all play a role in the person who we become as adults. And I think a person's cultural influences play one of the biggest roles in who we eventually become. When I was growing up, my best friend at the time, her name is Michelle, and we are still friends to this day. Shout out to her. Love you to death. But she comes from a Hispanic background. And throughout high school, she only dated Hispanic boys because dating outside of that went against her culture. It was in her nature to date within her culture, but as she grew up, her life experiences nurtured her, and she ended up with a life partner who is Black, and they have two beautiful children together. So, although a person's culture and circumstances do play a huge role in who they become, it isn't the only thing that matters. As a black man, growing up, there were things that my parents did and other members of my family did that I never questioned because I thought it was that way everywhere. For example, my parents would take old butter containers and reuse them as Tupperware. I didn't even grow up with real Tupperware because it was all reused containers from different items. Whenever I or my cousins were sick, we were told to go lay down, as if that was going to cure us. And it wasn't until I started living with my wife, who was Caucasian, by the way, that I realized my circumstances were not hers. I also realized that just because I grew up a certain way, that didn't mean I needed to continue living that way or raising my children that way. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the way I was brought up as a child. But what worked for me isn't necessarily going to work for my wife or kids. And that's okay. I think one of the major problems in today's society is we tend to focus on our circumstances, and oftentimes we blame that for our own shortcomings. We often blame the fact that we aren't doing well in life because of the circumstances in which we grew up in. And yeah, there are times where your circumstances do hold you back. I can admit that. For instance, if you grow up in the projects where there isn't access to the necessary resources, then yeah, it's going to be hard to shed that. But for the most part, a person can take what they've learned in life and use that to their advantage to make a better life for themselves. Break your nature and embrace the nurture. That's how you move forward. When it comes to the nature versus nurture debate, the example that I love to use and see is that of a person who was once racist due to the way they were raised, but is now an active member and activist for racial injustices. Situations like this often happen because as children, we believe what our parents tell us. If my mom would have told me that all white people were evil, I probably would have believed her, especially since all they teach in school is how inferior every other race has been, which is not true, by the way. And the schools need to learn a different way on how to teach history, but that's another topic for another day. Anyways, the point is, our first learning experiences come from home. And if you're taught at home to hate black people, then that's most likely what you're going to do. Those are your circumstances, your nature, and it's often the act of someone from another race being kind to you that breaks your racist thinking. Your learned experiences, aka nurturing. A story comes to mind for me when discussing this topic. Franklin McCallie, age 75, he grew up in the segregated South as an admittedly ignorant bigot, and today McCallie dedicates much of his time to promoting strong relationships between whites and blacks. So what was it that caused McCallie's views to change? As he tells it was an interaction he had at the age of 10 and a conversation he had in 1961 that forever changed him. Take a listen to his first testimony.
As a 10-year-old, I got on the bus from my school. Everybody was black. Except for one seat, there were no seats, and a black lady was sitting beside that seat. And this lady said, I'll never forget it. She said, honey, you can sit right here. And she patted the seat. She said, honey, twice. Honey, it's okay, you can sit. Elaine, I sat in that seat like this. I didn't move a muscle for 3 miles. I got off first. I went home. I didn't tell my parents I'd sat by a black woman.
All right, his next testimony comes from a time when he was in college speaking to another classmate about World War II. Take a listen.
Finally, I decided I'd say something. I said, John, let me ask you something. How come black troops in World War II fought so miserably? They surrendered, they didn't fight very hard. He said, Frank, where'd you hear that? I said, my father told me that. Now, John could have said, your father's an idiot. If he'd said it, the conversation is over. I never would have gone anywhere. He didn't say that. He said, Franklin, I don't think you and I know enough about that to discuss it intelligently. Save my face, save my father's face. He said, but let me ask you something. You have anybody fight in World War II? I said, yeah, I had 2 uncles. One was in the Philippines. One was at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. He said, is that right? He said, I did too. I had 2 uncles fight World War II. I said, great. He said, you know where we eat lunch? I said, you don't eat with me. He said, that's right. My uncles and I, who fought in World War II for freedom and justice and pursuit of happiness, we get on a bus and we ride 2 miles out of town to eat lunch because none of the stores we shop in will let us eat. And my stomach got tight and I didn't want to hear anymore. He said, did you go to the bathroom? I said, yeah, I go to the bathroom. He said, where do you go? I said, I go anywhere I want. He said, my uncles and I, we get on a bus. We ride 2 miles out of town to go to the bathroom because we can't go anywhere. I listened for the rest of the 3 hours. When I got to the dorm, I lay down and cried. I sobbed for 3 hours. Next day I went in and talked to the dean of men. I said, it's crazy. We're studying English and math and science. And right across the street over there, we got people, citizens we don't even know.
You see, it was the kindness that Mr. McCalley was shown by that woman on the bus and his college classmate that allowed him to let his guard down and try and understand that his views weren't acceptable, that the way he thought of himself as superior due to the color of his skin wasn't okay. He broke away from his nature and embraced the nurture, and today he is a better man for it. I get it though. Breaking your habits that you have had since childhood can be hard, sometimes impossible. I, myself, have had to learn how to break my nature in which I grew up. Growing up, I was very reserved. Still am, actually. And, it's a work in progress. However, this was how everyone was in my home. Therefore, it was all that I knew how to be. And, it caused major issues within my marriage because whereas my wife is open about everything, I tend to keep to myself about most things. And even when I do, keep it to myself, I don't mean to. Recently, though, due to therapy and my wife's patience and nurturing, I have gotten better at opening up. All right, let's take a minute and hear about our sponsors for today's episode.
My daddy uses Anchor to publish his podcast, and he loves it. Not only can he record, edit, and distribute on this platform, but he can make money at the same time, all for free. If you too would like to get started on your own podcast, go to the website anchor.fm or download the free Anchor app. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Let's go!
All right. Earlier, I mentioned how I thought that cultural influences played one of the biggest roles in the person we become, and I want to dive a little further into that before we wrap things up for this episode. Now, when I speak about breaking away from your nature, i.e. your culture or circumstances, I do not mean to just leave behind the things that have made you who you are. Culture is a way of life. That includes a person's beliefs, their values, their customs, traditions, their heritage, their language, their artistic expression, and so forth. To get rid of all of that would be ludicrous. What I mean by embrace your nurture is not to be afraid to try new things and let that cultivate or enrich the being you already are. It also means to unlearn the harmful stereotypes that our cultures perpetuate. Within any society, cultural stereotypes shape expectations and behaviors within children. Cultural stereotypes associated with gender differences are common in the United States and many other countries. For example, girls are assumed to be better attuned to emotions and social relationships than boys are, and therefore parents are more likely to talk about feelings with daughters than with sons. Although stereotypes are often based to some extent in actual group characteristics, stereotypes sometimes lead to biased perceptions of group members, memory distortions, and differential treatment. These are the things as a society that we should be working to get rid of. Break the nature of your cultural stereotypes. Embrace the nurture of different experiences and let that build you into the person you are meant to be. All right, let us wrap this up for the evening. Thank you for listening to another episode of Third Eye Podcast. I hope you find this episode to be insightful. If you do have any questions or would like to suggest any topics for me to discuss, also, if you would like to be a guest on this podcast, I can be reached on my new social media outlets. For Twitter and Instagram, you can follow me at third_eye_podcast, which is the number 3 followed by the letters RD. For Facebook, you can reach me at fb.me/thirdeyepodcast. Next week, I will have my very first guest on, and we will be discussing fatherhood, manhood, and the role men play in today's society. It's something that I've wanted to talk about for a few years now, and I'm very excited to do so. So please subscribe and share this with as many people as possible. I love you all, and remember, love each other and be kind to each other. Have a great night.